Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special event brought to you by the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA and co-sponsored by UCLA's Department of History, Levy Center for Jewish Studies, and Kahn Chair in Jewish History. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. Today's lecture is the second in an annual lecture series that was established through a bequest by the late Harry Sigman, who was a generous supporter of Israel Studies at UCLA. Born in France to parents who fled Hitler's Europe in the 1930s, Harry Sigman was a graduate of UCLA and Harvard Law School who went on to forge a prominent career in commercial law. He also worked as a consultant to governments and NGOs all over the world and taught at universities in the US, Europe, and Israel. I'm sure Harry would be happy to know that his gift has enabled us to host our distinguished speaker today. Before I introduce him, I'd like to note that today is Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. 73 years ago today, according to the Hebrew calendar, David Ben-Gurion read aloud the Declaration of Independence, officially establishing the State of Israel. Since that historic event, Israel has fought many wars, welcomed millions of Jewish immigrants from all over the world, and developed an advanced economy and a vibrant democracy. It has become a regional superpower, a high-tech hub, a multicultural society, and a source of pride to many Jews, both in Israel and around the world. Israel, of course, also has serious flaws and faces many challenges, internal and external. Its history, like that of any country, is complex, marked by accomplishments and progress, failures and setbacks. It is not simply a success story, as some believe it to be, but nor is it only a tragedy, as others may view it. No one has chronicled this story better than our speaker today, Tom Segev. Not only is he one of Israel's most distinguished journalists, working for many years as a reporter and columnist for Haaretz newspaper, but he is also one of Israel's leading and best-known historians, often described as one of Israel's new historians, who has challenged the country's traditional narratives. Born in Jerusalem in 1945 to parents who fled Nazi Germany, Dr. Segev received a BA in History and Political Science from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a Ph.D. in History from Boston University. He has written 9 books, which have been published in 15 languages. His books on Israel's history include 1949, The First Israelis, The 7th Million, Israelis and the Holocaust, 1967, Israel, the War and the Year That Transformed the Middle East, Elvis in Jerusalem, Post-Zionism and the Americanization of Israel, and One Palestine Complete, Jews and Arabs Under the British Mandate, which was the first book ever to win the National Jewish Book Award in 2 categories. His latest book is A State at Any Cost, The Life of David Ben-Gurion, in which he uses large amounts of previously unreleased archival material to give an original and nuanced account of Ben-Gurion's life. I've been reading Tom Segev's books and articles ever since I was in graduate school, and I can honestly say that his writing has significantly shaped my understanding of Israel's history. I'm deeply grateful to him for this, and I'm delighted to introduce him and to have a conversation with him after this lecture. During this conversation, I will pose some questions from the audience, so please send us your questions. And now, without any further ado, Tom Segev.
Thank you very much. People have asked me, why am I talking today about David Ben-Gurion instead of talking about Benjamin Netanyahu? In fact, about 2 years ago, Mr. Netanyahu arranged a little celebration for himself. On that day, he had been in office 1 day longer than David Ben-Gurion. This may have been the last happy occasion in the political career of Mr. Netanyahu, but it was very important for him. And I believe, it seems, that the longer Mr. Netanyahu remains in office, the more popular Ben-Gurion becomes. There is hardly a day without some reference to Ben-Gurion in the Israeli media. While I was working on this biography, 4 other biographies have been published about Ben-Gurion in Israel. And there has also been a movie, a very popular movie, a documentary has also been made about him. People actually went out to watch it, very successful documentary. So I concluded that the longer people are watching Netanyahu's politics, they are longing for Ben-Gurion's vision and integrity and statesmanship. There are some good reasons to support Netanyahu, but integrity is not necessarily the first. To be sure, there is a generation of Israelis who associate the term prime minister with the name Netanyahu, just as people of my generation grew up under Ben-Gurion and associated his name with the term prime minister. And so you won't be surprised if I tell you that a meeting with Ben-Gurion belongs to the deepest experiences of my life. This was now over 50 years ago. I went with two friends of mine to interview him at his home in the kibbutz, Sde Boker, in the Negev desert, for the newspaper, the student newspaper of the Hebrew University. He looked, as we know him, short, stocky, with a huge white lion's mane on his head, and very, very impressive. We were 23, he was almost 83, and I had a feeling as if I was facing Jewish history in person. We found him in a pensive mood, preoccupied with the past. He told us a lot about the achievements, the Zionist movement and its achievement. This was at the eve of Israel's 20th anniversary. He also told us about his hometown, Plonsk, which is about 40 miles north of Warsaw. I remember a sad man, disappointed and very, very lonely. He talked to us also about his wife, Paula, who had just died a few months before. And I shall never forget how all of a sudden he said, almost whispering, I wanted another child. Paula didn't want to. And I remember how taken aback we were. Why would he take us into the most intimate chambers of his life? He told us something else which surprised us, and that was that at the age of 3, he knew that he won't remain in Plonsk, won't grow up in Plonsk, but go to Palestine. Because even as a toddler of 3, he was an ardent Zionist. We still have the tape of that conversation, and you hear me asking Mr. Ben-Gurion, this is something you knew at the age of 3? And he gets very excited. Yes, yes, of course. We're very agitated. Yes, of course. All the children were Zionists. Of course, we believed in Zionists. 3 years. Yes, of course. Why not? So it sounded odd to me. Indeed, at that time, Mr. Ben-Gurion was often no longer fully connected with reality. But in later years, when I got into working on his biography, it occurred to me that maybe it wasn't that absurd after all. Okay, not 3, but at the age of 13, Ben-Gurion and his friends founded a club for the advancement of the Hebrew language in Plonsk. They began to teach each other Hebrew. They began to talk Hebrew with each other. They would also correspond in Hebrew, good Hebrew, quite rich Hebrew. And what they were hoping was to convince the entire Jewish population of Plonsk to speak Hebrew. This, of course, was naive, romantic, perhaps a little bit eccentric as he was, because most Jews of Plonsk spoke Polish and Russian and Yiddish and had no intention of moving to Palestine. Most of them were not Zionists. So Ben-Gurion is a difficult figure, difficult character for a biographer, because very often it's difficult to understand what exactly does he mean. The difficulty is also to distinguish between vision and fantasy in what he says. Ben-Gurion was a man of both. What's important is that the classical Zionism, the Zionism of Haaretz, was almost everything to Ben-Gurion from a very early age on. The core of his personality, the essence of his identity. He never had any doubts about it. He never deviated from the central line of Zionism. Ben-Gurion came to Palestine in 1906 when he was about 20. He brought his Zionist ideology with him. At that time, he tended to understand it as a modern version of the humanistic teachings of the prophets of the Bible, including peace and freedom and justice. The best definition I can give you to the Zionism of Ben-Gurion would be a Jewish state in Palestine at any cost, as soon as possible, with as many Jews as possible, a solid Jewish majority eventually, as much land as possible, not necessarily the entire country, but as much land as possible, and as few Arabs as possible. And this is something he was able to achieve, and the price was very high. In my book, I concentrate on the price, the political price, and also the moral price. 73 years later, Israel does stand for one of the most dramatic success stories of the 20th century. If you compare international statistics, the UN, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, there are always about 170 countries listed, and Israel is always listed among the top 15, which means that most Israelis today live better lives than most other people in the world. Basically, Israel is a democracy. Most people in the world do not live in democracies. Israel is strong enough to defend itself. It is a high-tech superpower. And recently, we have been able to become one of the few countries in the world to overcome, more or less, defeat the corona pandemic. More Jews than ever before in the history of Palestine are now living in Israel. And all this stems from the infrastructures which were laid during the days of Ben-Gurion. So Ben-Gurion's contribution to the history of Israel is not limited to the efforts to create the state, but also to the infrastructures which made its later success possible. But having said all that, we should not forget that we are facing a number of problems which Ben-Gurion also faced, and they remain without solution to the present day. First of all, our life is life without peace. And secondly, we have been unable to agree on a common definition, a national Israeli, Zionist, Jewish definition of our collective identity. Ben-Gurion did not believe that peace is possible. And I think that most Israelis and most Palestinians today share that view. And he was unable to define the meaning of a Jewish state. Who is a Jew? Who is a Zionist? What is an Israeli identity? So until today, our future is rather bleak. In working on this book, I reached the conclusion that we are going through a process, an historical process, which has not failed, but has also not fully succeeded yet. And that process began under Ben-Gurion and includes the settlement policy in the occupied Palestinian territories. I have a grandson who will be 3 years old next week, and he has not yet told me if he's a Zionist. Lior was born in Tel Aviv, and I often think of him and his future life. Where will he find his happiness? Or in other words, how long will Israel survive? Of course, work on this book also led me to deal with questions of power, the solitude of power. And I was also wondering, how does one define a great leader? Ben-Gurion offered us an answer to that. So I never found myself bored at all, even one day, in the company of this amazingly complex and fascinating character. In recent years, documents, secret documents, official documents, which had been secret, were opened for research, including cabinet minutes, and they make it possible to reach a deeper understanding of this, a tri-dimensional understanding of this man who was full of conflicts and contradictions, with frequent, sudden transitions from deep, deep depression to the heights of almost uncontrollable happiness, and an endless row of irrational outbursts. And the interesting thing about all this is that Ben-Gurion was aware of his mental setup. He wrote about it in his diary. At one place, he writes, "Those people who will one day read my diary may get the impression that it was written by two different people." So that's, I think, quite a high degree of self-awareness. The diary, by the way, is a fascinating document. Ben-Gurion started writing his diary at the age of 14, and he wrote almost every day. He wrote constantly later on in life, always in small notebooks of school children. People sometimes describe that when they talk to him, they don't see his face. They only see his head, because he's constantly writing in real time. He left us millions of words. And so we can get, I think, a better picture of this man who in earlier times looked like a statue carved of stone or cast in steel, standing on some high pillar. I discovered a man who can be romantic, who can be poetic, who loves nature and tends to describe nature, sometimes very beautifully, be it sunset in Palestine, or the Niagara Falls in America, or the Swiss Alps. And what I particularly liked about him was his journalistic instincts, his journalistic talent to view things around him, see, listen, and describe. He left some very nice journalistic descriptions of situations which he had experienced, and deduced interesting conclusions from them. I'll give you an example. London, February 1947. one of the coldest months in the recorded weather history of Great Britain. Ben-Gurion had a meeting with the head of the Conservative Party, Oliver Stanley. The meeting took place in the Dorchester Hotel in London. And when Ben-Gurion got there, he realized that the hotel was not heated. And Stanley told him, stay in your coat, don't take off your coat. I don't take off my coat. And so Ben-Gurion asked himself, how is it possible that one of the most expensive hotels in Europe, in the strongest imperial power, is not heated? The answer was that the British Empire is obviously sinking, and the British won't stay long in Palestine. The question is, of course, is this a true story? I can't be sure, but I have no reason to assume that Ben-Gurion invented it, just as I have no reason to assume that he invented another story that comes from a hotel in Paris. He sits in his room, and a guest from an upper floor comes down, knocks on the door, he opens, and he finds himself facing Ho Chi Minh. So he asks him in, Ben-Gurion talks about his national movement, Ho Chi Minh talks about his national movement, and at one time, Ho Chi Minh suggests to him maybe he should set up a Zionist government in exile with headquarters in Hanoi. Can it be? Yes, it can be, because Ho Chi Minh was indeed in that hotel on that day. This is something we can, but again, I have no reason to assume that Ben-Gurion invented that little story, particularly, and this is one of the main difficulties in doing this biography, Ben-Gurion had absolutely no sense of humor. In the political crisis which we experience these days in Israel, we sometimes forget how deep and how painful the controversies were which Ben-Gurion created. And we sometimes also forget the fact that his party, his Social Democratic Labour Party, Mapai, never received more than 47 seats out of the 120 seats in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, which means that 2 out of 3 Israelis always did not support him during each election. Each election, 2 out of 3 people did not support him. Of course, Netanyahu today would be happy with 47 seats. In 1919, Ben-Gurion participated in a discussion, a public discussion about the proper attitude to the Arabs of Palestine. People raised different points, made different suggestions and had different views, and Ben-Gurion interrupted them and said, everyone sees how difficult the relations between Jews and Arabs are, but not everyone sees that there is no solution to that question. There is no solution. There is an abyss, and nothing can fill that abyss. 2 nations are facing off against each other. We want Palestine to be ours as a nation. The Arabs want it to be theirs as a nation. I don't know what Arab would agree that Palestine belongs to the Jews. 1919, over 100 years ago, there is no solution. And this was the basic policy and security assumption that directed Ben-Gurion throughout the struggle for the creation of Israel, and later as Israel's first prime minister. In today's language, we would say this is a problem that can't be solved, but it can be managed. I think this is Ben-Gurion is the inventor of that formula. He used to share with his audience a number of formative experiences that shaped his basic approach to the conflict. There was, for example, an Arab young man who had befriended him when they were both students at the University of Istanbul. Later, Ben-Gurion was expelled from Palestine, and a day or so before he had to leave, he met this guy on the street and told him that he has to leave. So this guy tells him, as your friend, I'm very sorry for you. As an Arab, I'm very happy. 1,000 times, Ben-Gurion repeated that story in almost every discussion of the conflict. And he had a conversation with Musa Alami, a well-known Palestinian leader. Ben-Gurion tried to convince him that Zionism will be good for everybody in Palestine, Jews and Arabs alike. Everybody will benefit from the progress which Zionism is bringing. Alami's answer was, as far as I'm concerned, the country may remain desolate for 100 years more, as long as we develop it and not you. 1,000 times, Ben-Gurion repeated that story. So this was to be part of the price for life in an independent Jewish state in Palestine. It was to be life without peace, and Ben-Gurion accepted that. In order to create a Jewish state and a Jewish majority and maintain them in Palestine, it was necessary to do so as soon as possible. Jewish majority as soon as possible in at least part of the country, as I said. And in this context, Ben-Gurion supported a British partition plan, 1937, the famous Peel Plan. The British suggested to partition the country and move out the Arab population from that part of the country which was to become Jewish. Ben-Gurion read this with great enthusiasm and reacted in his diary with the words forced transfer in Hebrew, transfer kafui, and underlined these words. And from that point on, Ben-Gurion identified himself with the transfer idea, openly supported it, forcefully supported it, and from time to time looked into possible ways to implement it. So the price required for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine was not only life without peace, but also a national tragedy for the Palestinians. 1937. 10 years later, it happened. Ben-Gurion and the War of 1948 is a big story, big subject. Ben-Gurion was the commander-in-chief of Israel's War of Independence, as we call it, the Nakba, the catastrophe, as the Palestinians call it. 6,000 Israeli soldiers were killed in that war, 1% of the population. One of them was my father. And of course, thousands of Arabs were also dead. And when the war was over, very few Arabs were left in Israel. About 700,000 Arabs were no longer there. They left, they escaped, they were forced to escape, and they were driven out. The reason why I'm using all these terms is because all of them are true. It is very important to distinguish what exactly happened when and where. The story is quite complicated, and this is also one reason why the creation of the Palestinian tragedy is still in debate, in historical debate, in a clash between narratives. There is one thing which is not in debate, and that is that Israel did not let them come back. There are clear government decisions about that, open decisions, very well documented ones. And at least in that sense, Israel bears at least part of the responsibility for the perpetuation of the problem. And I, for one, regret that we have not been able to acknowledge our responsibility, at least partial responsibility, for the tragedy of the Palestinians until now. Now entering another minefield, Ben-Gurion and God, Ben-Gurion and religion, Ben-Gurion and the politics of religion. Ben-Gurion was a secular man. He ate pork, he worked on Yom Kippur, documented in his diary. And he was troubled throughout his life with the question of God. What is God? Is there a God? As a young man, he believed that there is no such thing as God. He believed that God could not have chosen the Jewish people, but rather the Jewish people have chosen a God for themselves. And more than anything else, he tried to define the meaning of a secular Jew. As prime minister, he once went to Myanmar, which was then Burma, to take lessons in Buddhism, because he had this idea that Buddhism is a religion without God. So that fascinated him enough to go there and take lessons. And upon coming back, he regarded himself as an expert on Buddhism and wrote a long article in the New York Times about it. Naturally, he was often asked, Mr. Ben-Gurion, do you believe in God? We also asked him, Mr. Ben-Gurion, do you believe in God? Actually, we did not say Mr. Ben-Gurion anymore. We were there for 3 hours, actually. And after a while, we began just saying Ben-Gurion. So we asked, Ben-Gurion, do you believe in God? And in response, he told us about a visit he once had to a scientific institute in Sweden, in Uppsala. There, they showed him a machine that can measure the millionth part of a second. The millionth part of a second. I can still hear him say that. Millionth part of a second. Can't be. Can't be without some kind of superior power. There must be some kind of superior power. Not an old man sitting on a throne with a long beard ruling the world, but some kind of superior power. In last interviews of his life, he would simply answer, yes, I believe in God. But as prime minister, he tended to avoid theological discussions of that kind and keep the relations between religious and secular on a political level. It was just a political subject. I do not argue with you who is Jew. I am just looking for a political arrangement that would make it possible for us to deal with that question. He also felt that the state has an obligation to provide certain services to the religious communities, such as education, synagogues, kosher food in the army, and others. In other words, there is no separation between religion and state. And he was able to recognize that the relations between religious people and secular people are not symmetric. This is not easy because many secular Israelis don't understand that. They say I don't disturb you to go to the synagogue on Shabbat. Don't disturb me to open my supermarket on Shabbat. And Ben-Gurion realized that it doesn't always work like that. There are some things which Orthodox people cannot accept. An Orthodox man cannot accept that his daughter will be drafted to the army. It won't be. The Orthodox will simply leave the country. It won't be, and it isn't. So Ben-Gurion was able to understand that, and that I think he deserves credit for that, because it's not something taken for granted. Under Ben-Gurion, and also later, almost all controversies between religious people and secular people in Israel ended in a compromise. And the first such compromise goes back to 1920 under Ben-Gurion. 1920, elections were to be held in Jerusalem for the first time to some communal body. The Orthodox communities in Jerusalem announced that they will not participate in the elections because they objected to the right of women to vote. Women cannot participate in the election. So Ben-Gurion started the whole set of negotiations and had all kinds of ideas, maybe separate voting polls or whatever. Eventually, he worked out the following compromise. Women will be allowed to vote. This is 1920, quite early in the history of the world on that subject of women's voting. But women in Jerusalem, 1920, will vote. Assuming that Orthodox women will stay at home, it was agreed that the vote of every Orthodox man will be counted twice. And that's the way it was done. I have once mentioned that example at some other university, and I was asked whether this is still the law today. So rest assured it is not. But in later years, lots of other compromises were accepted. Thus, for instance, we have no civil marriage in Israel, and many thousands of young Orthodox men are exempt from the army. When we were sitting with Ben-Gurion, he did not want us to describe him as the founder of the state. Indeed, the state of Israel was created at the peak of a long period, 30 years of Zionist efforts with the active assistance of the British. But like many other national leaders, Ben-Gurion identified himself with history, and many people identified history with him. In almost every situation, he claimed to know what needs to be done. And he very much wanted to be a leader. He very much wanted everything leadership had to offer. The fulfillment of a dream, which for him was also self-fulfillment, responsibility, power, a place in history. And I think that people believed him because they believed that he believes in himself. He had an almost unlimited talent of organizational skill and talent. He was very diligent, working very, very hard, many, many hours a day. Apparently, no detail was too small to interest him. And he was also very good in taking up new subjects and study them, including leadership. He studied the kind of leadership which is needed in order to direct a nation to a new historical destiny. In 1923, he visited the Soviet Union, and upon returning home, he summed up the leadership of Lenin. This is an amazing sentence. It is 200 words long, and the terms Bolshevism, communism, and Zionism do not appear there because it is a theoretical model of the ideal leader. A man who disdains all obstacles, faithful to his goal. A man of iron will who does not spare human life and the blood of innocent children for the sake of the revolution. He is not afraid of rejecting today what he required yesterday and requiring tomorrow what he rejected today. His sharp and clear eyes see only the naked reality, the eternal truth, and the actual power relations burning with red flame, the goal of the great revolution. He wanted to be a Zionist Lenin. He wanted to be sometimes a Zionist Churchill. I think that no one was able to define Ben-Gurion's leadership better than Ben-Gurion himself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We now have some time for questions and conversation. So I want to encourage our audience members to continue to send in your questions. I will be trying to pay as much attention to them as possible. Let me begin with the question of writing a biography of Ben-Gurion. And there's a couple of questions that we've been receiving about that. First of all, the value of biographies. Historians today, many historians today, tend to kind of criticize biographies or denigrate them as you know, great person view of history, right? That emphasizing the role of individuals as the mover of events rather than complex processes, trends, etc. Do you think what value do you think as a historian biographies have in this respect? I mean, you know, as opposed to writing these more kind of materialist views of history or views of history that de-emphasize the role of great people. And why, just as an add-on, why do you think in the case of Israel's history, there is still this production of biographies of these Zionist leaders?
The more important a person is, the more influential a person is, the more a person leads sometimes a whole movement behind him, the more it is interesting to know him or her and see what kind of influence they actually had. So this is a very legitimate factor among other historical factors. It doesn't come instead of other factors, but with all due respect, other factors don't come instead of biographies. So biographies very often make good reading, and that's a good way of approaching, of presenting history to readers who may otherwise not read heavy research. But I can tell you that I worked on this biography for almost 6 years. So I practically read everything that can be read. I know, unfortunately, there are many things which I have not been able to see because they are not open yet. So there is room for more biographies in later years. But I don't really think that the genre of a biography needs to defend itself.
So you mentioned that there have been, you know, other recent biographies of Ben-Gurion and others in the past. How does your biography of him, how does your treatment of him differ from some of these other biographies, in particular something like Tevet's famous biography?
Okay, Shabtai Tevet really started a project which can be compared a little bit to Carol's project of President Johnson. I mean, many values and really very great. He died before he finished it. And what's more important, he did that about 40 years ago. And in the last 40 years, we really have much more material, original Ben-Gurion material, letters, documents, the diary, as I said, We have them today. Tevet didn't have them. Tevet also wrote at a very early stage, I think, of the state, before we were mature enough to look at the facts which we find with some kind of distance, some kind of, in a more critical way, compare them with documents which we have from other countries. So I think this is why it was on time to write a full-length biography. There's one biography out which concentrates on the last years of Ben-Gurion by Abi Shilon, who is now, I believe, with New York University. There is one biography by Anita Shapira, who is the dean of Israeli historians of Zionism, of course. But this is more a reflective volume. It is not really so much the information which interested her, more her own reflections on Ben-Gurion and Zionism. A very interesting book. But and there is another one which is twice as long as mine, and so by Yossi Goldstein, and this one I have not yet been able to read even, but I'm sure that it's okay. I write for readers. Some academics write for other academics who look above their shoulder and check their footnotes. I write for readers. I want my books to be read, and so it is also slightly different in the way it's being written from other books.
So a few questions have come in about Ben-Gurion's views and about his beliefs. One question concerns, you mentioned at the beginning, Ben-Gurion's Zionism and his commitment to establishing a Jewish state with as much land as possible, with as many Jews as possible, and with few Arabs as possible. When did that, you identified that he started supporting the idea of transfer in the late 1930s. Was the idea of a Jewish state, was his commitment to statehood from the beginning, or was it something that it also evolved? I mean, other historians, I'm thinking of Dmitry Shumsky from the Hebrew University, have suggested that, Ben-Gurion only in the 1930s started to think about a Jewish state, and before that he was open to, maybe autonomy for Jews within a larger state or some kind of federal arrangement. Do you accept that, or do you think he was always a state was always his goal?
No, Zionism is all about Jewish statehood in Palestine, period. Now let's discuss details, but the basic principle is Jewish statehood in Palestine, nothing less. In Palestine, which means not necessarily all of Palestine. I mentioned 1937 because that's a point where we really have that extraordinary statement in his diary where he says forced transfer. So that's 1937. But as I said, beginning in 1919, as a young man, really before anything happened, before the first Arab terror action started, Ben-Gurion believed that this is really a conflict that does not have a solution, and therefore the only way to manage it is to establish a solid majority in at least part of the country. A solid majority means that the Arabs have to be moved out, as the British said. Ben-Gurion, before that, discussed plans for transfer in exchange for money. He thought of maybe we strike a deal, for example, with Iraq. Some British people also had this idea. But the feeling was that Jews and Arabs cannot live in peace in the same state.
So you don't think his views really evolved in any way? He was really had these principles, had these beliefs from early in his life, and he stuck by them all the time while remaining flexible about when to implement these ideas?
From the very start, one of the first efforts which he undertook when he came to Palestine was to convince Jewish farmers to get rid of their Arab workers. This was an ideological effort. It was called Hebrew labor. And of course, Jewish farmers in Palestine were interested in Jewish labor because they were cheaper and more experienced, and they talk less socialist ideology than Ben-Gurion and his friends. But this was the first national endeavor which Ben-Gurion really started. And I think that a direct line leads between this idea of Hebrew labor and the tragedy of 1948.
I wonder then, I mean, you know, at the time and years afterwards, Ben-Gurion's views were often contrasted with the rival Jabotinsky. You know, we had kind of labor Zionism and the revisionism. Given what you're saying about Ben-Gurion's fatalism, almost about the inability to solve the conflict, his recognition of the Arabs of Palestine as opponents, as unyielding opponents of Zionism, do you think Ben-Gurion adopted Jabotinsky's views, or vice versa, or maybe there isn't such a great difference between these two men as we often imagine it to be?
Okay, the common way to describe them is to say Jabotinsky is on the right and Ben-Gurion is on the left. In reality, both were remarkably pragmatic and on the center. So Jabotinsky could permit himself to talk more ideology because he was never in a position of responsibility. Ben-Gurion was more pragmatic. So, but in reality, it's important to remember that both of them belong in the same movement, which is the Zionist movement. But there are different lines of action. So the differences are mainly tactic. And I think that they were much smaller than we tend to feel, particularly also because Jabotinsky later led to Jabotinsky's movement became the Likud and Netanyahu. And so we feel that there is an abyss between left and right. In reality, they share the same goal, a Jewish state on as much land as possible. So Jabotinsky says all of it and all of the Jordan and all the way up to Syria. Ben-Gurion says, well, maybe once, but right now we need a state. There is one statement of Ben-Gurion which he did not. This is one of those statements where I say it's sometimes difficult to understand how serious it is, but he did say at one time that if he would get only Tel Aviv as a Jewish state, he would start with that. Let's start with something. So Jabotinsky, of course, would say, no, we need the entire country and everything. He would say, yeah, well, that maybe we'll see where we get. So I think it's a difference between an ideologue and somebody who is actually has responsibility to act.
So in a sense, both of them are kind of territorial maximalists ideologically. I mean, when, for example, the British carved Transjordan out of the Palestine mandate in 1922, and obviously that gave birth to the revisionist Zionist movement and the demand for the Jewish state on both banks of the Jordan River. Do you think Ben-Gurion then, you know, while accepting this, ultimately had this belief that Israel's borders or the Jewish state's borders would be subject to change over time and could continue to expand and ultimately
Definitely.
even Jordan?
Definitely. Ben-Gurion believed, even the partition plan of the UN of 1947, Ben-Gurion said, let's accept it. But borders in Palestine never remain the same. Look back to the days of the Bible. Look back to all the powers who invaded Palestine. We had such borders, we had other borders. We will have ideal borders, perhaps one day, let's start with something. And in 1948, interestingly enough, Ben-Gurion decreed that the West Bank and Gaza would not be occupied during the war of Accreted. Why? Because these territories were now full with Arab refugees who had left the parts of the future Israel. So he said, we just got rid of them. Why would I invade those territories and take them all in? And that's very much the argument which we are still leading today in Israeli politics, the future of the territories, the future of the relations with the Palestinians. But Ben-Gurion's decision was not to take those territories, including East Jerusalem. And Begin, who was a follower of Jabotinsky, constantly attacked Ben-Gurion as leader of the opposition for having taken that decision, forsaking Jerusalem, forsaking the land of Israel, or something like that.
So one aspect of his views we haven't yet talked about is his understanding of democracy. This is to nowadays in Israel, there's growing concerns about Israel, the fabric of Israeli democracy and the challenges in particular to the judiciary and the Supreme Court. Ben-Gurion famously, didn't enact a constitution for Israel, or decided not to in the face of opposition. Yet he was a democratically elected leader. How would you understand his views of democracy? Was it kind of the more majoritarian democracy, this idea that democracy is essentially majority rule, or did he have some kind of commitment to what we call today liberal democracy?
The Israeli Declaration of Independence, which was written almost single-handedly by Ben-Gurion, states even a date where we will have a constitution 3 months later, and we didn't. And in cabinet, Ben-Gurion then said, but I wrote this document, so I understand what I meant by it. I did not mean what you think, that we will have a constitution. And we didn't have one, mostly again, or a lot because of the objection of the Orthodox. The Orthodox cannot accept a secular constitution.
You are now back. Welcome back. Yes. So you were talking about his attitudes toward the Constitution, or lack thereof.
So I was saying that the Declaration of Independence, which was single-handedly written by Ben-Gurion, does state a certain date, an exact date on which we will have a constitution. And 3 months later, Ben-Gurion explains to the cabinet, no, I'm the one who wrote that Declaration of Independence. I know what constitution means, and we will not have a constitution. The reason why, there are two main reasons. A, because of the difficulties of the Orthodox population in Israel, who cannot accept a secular constitution, because it will mean that they are giving it preference over the rules of the Torah. And Ben-Gurion understood that. But also, Ben-Gurion hated everybody who tried to limit his power. There was nothing he hated more than lawyers. Why would anyone say no to me just because he thinks that if that's the law, find the legal way, how I can do it? So he was quite authoritarian, always, I think, in his own image, he believed to be a great Democrat, but he would always say, the state comes first. This is also part of what it means when he says a state at any cost. The cost can be limitations to democracy. In fact, for the first 20 years, the Arab population in Israel was held under military rule, very authoritarian, arbitrary, corrupt. An Arab citizen needed a permit every time he wanted to leave his village, be it for a visit to the doctor or to the market or to a wedding or whatever. And so this lasted for 20 years and is I think to the present day, a stain on the history of the Israeli democracy. On the other hand, we did have many freedoms. And basically, we still are a democracy. Democracies are always in danger. Democracies always need maintaining, just like maintenance, just like a human body or a car. And I think that the maintenance of the Israeli democracy is quite poor in recent years, and that's why many people feel that we are actually losing it. We're not yet losing it, but it is in danger. I think that the danger to Israeli democracy is probably the worst danger which we face now, including Iran. This is really a danger, but it needs to be maintained well.
But in historical terms, I suppose you might say that, you know, compared to the era of Ben-Gurion, during which, as you know, there was this military government, Israel is more democratic today than it was in Ben-Gurion's era. That in many ways, I mean, even we have had a question, you know, would it even describe Ben-Gurion as a kind of autocrat, or would-be autocrat at least? Given that, I mean, would it be right to classify or regard Israel as a democracy during his time in office, or was it on the way to being a democracy, and in which case we might see Israel today as more democratic than it was back then?
It's very, very difficult to compare because everything was new. They were creating a state out of nothing, also with no experience. These people had no political experience before. Many of them had read more books than politicians read today. But you know, everything was new, and this is also why I think that sometimes people compare Netanyahu with Ben-Gurion. I also made such a comparison, but the basic thing is that Netanyahu was actually born into the state which Ben-Gurion created, so it's completely different. And what may have been justified 70 years ago in terms of a state at any cost is no longer justified today, where we are in a much better situation. We can we are strong enough to defend ourselves. We have democratic traditions now. We have the tradition of the Israeli Supreme Court, and so we have the tradition of a free press. All these things were totally new under Ben-Gurion, and I think it's important to say, yes, he was very autocratic, but as far as possible, he let democracy work.
So we've had some questions coming in about his attitudes towards his view about anti-Semitism and his response to the Shoah, to the Holocaust. First of all, you mentioned before that, you know, Ben-Gurion was consistent in his views, that they really didn't significantly change over time. How did the Holocaust affect his views, and particularly with regards to his understanding of anti-Semitism and of Israel? Did he see then as Israel as being a target for anti-Semitism? Did he worry about that? How did he see anti-Semitism in the world, particularly in the aftermath of the Holocaust?
For Ben-Gurion, the Holocaust was first and foremost not a crime against humanity, not a crime against the Jewish people, but a crime against the state of Israel, because the people who were killed by the Nazis were the ones who Ben-Gurion expected to be in Israel, to become Israelis, to live in Israel. This is the population he counted on, and this population was gone now. As a result, unwillingly, but without any other alternative, the Zionist movement discovered the Jews living in the Arab countries. Before that, Zionism had very, very little interest, very, very little information even on Jews in Arab countries. But since the Jews of Europe were gone, it was necessary to look elsewhere. And this is something that caused Ben-Gurion deep disappointment. But when he thought of the Holocaust, he thought this is really a crime against the state of Israel. And during the Holocaust, he believed that there is nothing he can do. And there was nothing the Zionists could really do during the Holocaust. Before World War II, the the Zionist organization was able to launch one big rescue operation in form of an agreement with the government of Nazi Germany, whereby Jews were allowed to leave Nazi Germany and move to Palestine. So tens of thousands of Jews were thus allowed to Palestine, my parents included. But otherwise, he was concentrating himself on efforts that he would take after the war, after Nazi Germany would be defeated. He felt that the only way to save Jews was to defeat Nazi Germany, which I think was true. And so there are a number of cases which keep coming up. The case of Slovakia, the case of Romania, the case of Hungary. Was it possible to save more Jews or not? And to the present day, these are stories with question marks hanging over them, which is why they keep coming up. Sometimes it is much more painful to live with question marks than with solid answers. So these cases keep coming up, and there are people who accuse Ben-Gurion of having neglected rescue operations. I think that he did not try everything that could be tried in the case of Hungary, but the reason was that he realized that there is no point. So it's not something, according to the best of my knowledge, it's not something he missed. The interesting thing about him is the attitude. He lived in the future. Israel was a very future-oriented society, and he kept talking about the need to rescue Jews, but he was always rescuing them after the Holocaust, after the war, bringing the rest of them to Palestine. Basically, he believed that Holocaust survivors can be of little help for the future state. He left some terrible views about Holocaust survivors. He felt that if somebody survived, he said that if somebody survived the Holocaust, he must have been an evil person, because otherwise he wouldn't survive. He survived on the expense of somebody else. And these people were often very weak, sick, mentally weak. And so he felt that they don't help much in the project, which he felt he needs to. So that's an unpleasant part of Ben-Gurion's attitude. You asked about anti-Semitism. Well, what should I say? That he was against anti-Semitism?
Something that could be, I mean, like earlier Zionists that would disappear over time, Israel took his place among the nations, or did he think that in fact Israel would become the target of anti-Semitism?
No, he had a very unclear attitude towards Jews living abroad. For example, Jews living in America. Theoretically, he wanted them all in Palestine, but nobody knew better than him that without the help of an influential, strong Jewish community in America, Israel would never be, Israel would never survive, Israel would never win the war of 1948. And so he was always torn between his views, to a point where late in life, as I said, when he was all kind of other eccentric things he did and said, he announced that he is no longer a Zionist, because if Jews living in America describe themselves as Zionists, then I am not a Zionist. There is a story where he meets somebody from Chicago, I think, who comes to him and tells him what a fantastic villa he has in Chicago, and he calls it Villa Palestine. And Ben-Gurion tells him, I wish you had a fantastic villa in Tel Aviv, and called it Villa Chicago. So he never really knew, but as I said, he was never able to define who is a Jew. And we are unable to agree on a definition. Even today, there are many definitions. But this went so far that at one point he addressed, in the name of the government of Israel, 50 learned Jews living abroad, most of them not Israeli citizens, some of them, most of them living abroad, not Israeli citizens, asking them to help him to define who is a Jew. So this is a very strange, I think, a unique moment in the history of nations, that a prime minister should address himself to people living outside this country and say, excuse me, who am I? Tell me, who am I?
And to value the opinion of intellectuals as well.
Right. So we have those 50, he received 50 answers. Most of them were limited to the religious definition. He told him, don't ask me. A Jew is somebody whose mother is Jewish, period. But that wasn't enough for the legal and political situation in those days in Israel. And so the interesting thing about it is how much effort and he invested in both these terms, Jew and Zionist. So Ben-Gurion was really the leader of a national movement which wasn't able to define itself. That's quite unique.
So we've got lots of questions, many more than we have time to ask, unfortunately. But I do want to end with one last question that's come in from Professor Myron Aronoff, and it's an important question about Ben-Gurion's views of Mizrahi Jews, of Jews from North Africa and Italy. She mentioned before his belief that it was European Jews who would be the kind of the human resources, if you like, for Zionism. What if you could very briefly, because we're almost out of time, describe or discuss his views about Mizrahi Jews? Were they kind of Eurocentric, condescending? How did he view this population?
Okay, I think it's first of all, I think it's important to say that he did not have a racist attitude to Mizrahi Jews, because I think that racism requires some kind of hatred. He did not hate Mizrahi Jews. He felt that they are unhelpful for the future of the Israeli state. Their only merit was that they were Jewish, and he needed lots of Jews in Palestine. And so that's, as I said, unwillingly, they were brought to Israel. By the way, very often they couldn't stay in Arab country as a result of the Zionist struggle in Palestine, the war of 1948. And so they had to be brought. But Ben-Gurion felt that they are more of a burden. And he received many reports that explained to him that they are not good soldiers, they don't obey, they tend more than others to commit war crimes. There is one point where he says it is a problem bringing these Jews from Arab countries to Israel, because they may be mistaken for terrorists, for Arab terrorists. And also vice versa, an Arab terrorist will enter a movie theater, and everybody will think that he is a Mizrahi Jew. So all these things are an expression of, I think, a very alienated attitude, and the only ones which he tended to love were the Yemenites. This goes back to a very, very early time of Ben-Gurion in Palestine, when Yemenite Jews were brought to Palestine in order to replace Arab workers. And so, but they were never treated as equal. And there was a lot of, today perhaps you might say, Orientalist kind of talk about them, how they really represent the Jews from the Bible and things like that. But All this was very problematic, I would say, and there are some sayings which people even today quote from Ben-Gurion as proof that how he intended to discriminate Jews from Arab countries, which is not necessarily true, but under Ben-Gurion, Jews from Arab countries were discriminated. There's no question about that. And I think that part of the reason, the main reason was that Ben-Gurion felt that they do not deliver what he wanted them to deliver. They're not, they're not helpful enough. And it's not a racist kind of hatred.
So unfortunately, we're out of time. We have lots of questions that we couldn't have time to answer, but I will certainly share them with Dr. Segev. Some of the interesting questions coming in about what Ben-Gurion would make of Israeli politics today, how he would view the ultra-Orthodox and the status quo agreement, how he would view Netanyahu. But unfortunately, we don't have time to get into this. We'll have to have Dr. Segev back maybe for another conversation where we can talk about some of those questions. But I want to thank you, Dr. Segev, for sharing your insights and your knowledge about Ben-Gurion. It's been a really fascinating conversation. And I want to thank all of our audience members for joining us for this. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get through all of your questions, but I want to encourage you all to please come to our future events. We have 2 upcoming literary events, which I hope will interest you. Next Thursday on April 22nd, Professor Yael Halevi-Wise will discuss the work of A.B. Yehoshua, one of Israel's foremost contemporary novelists. And on the following Thursday, April 29th, we have acclaimed Israeli author Ayelet Sabari, who will be discussing her memoir, The Art of Leaving, about growing up Mizrahi in Israel. So I hope you will join us for these events. I want to thank you, Dr. Segev, again for joining us with us today, and see you all next time. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.